guys, I'm excited to have Gez Medinger here today from London, England. He is a voice that resonates deeply in our community as an investigative science journalist, filmmaker, and marathon runner. Jez's life took a dramatic turn when he contracted COVID in the pandemic's early days. And next, faced with the challenges of long haul COVID, he channeled his experience into groundbreaking research and advocacy, turning his YouTube channel into a amazing vital resource with over 5 million views. So what he has to share today could be a valuable key in your recovery journey. So let's listen in and learn together. So welcome, Gez. I'm so happy to have you here. Thank you for doing this.
Oh, thank you. Absolute pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I have so much to dive into here, but a great place always to start is just, how did this all start for you?
March 2020, I was in the process of training for my fourth marathon, which was going to be London Marathon. And the pandemic was coming in, and we all kind of thought, we'll all be sort of, I don't know. Everybody had a lot of conflicting feelings that was tough at that point in time, right? So we didn't quite know how society was going to deal with it, how we were going to deal with it. Anyway, pretty much the whole of London caught COVID in the first 2 weeks of March. And I did too. My acute infection was unremarkable, not as bad as a bunch of my friends who also had it. Certainly nowhere near bad enough to consider going to the hospital or anything like that. It was unpleasant, but I've had worse flus. Because I was marathon training, I thought, well, I don't want to lose my fitness. So after the 7 days isolation was up, I started going for little jogs, and I thought, I'll keep the heart rate down. I don't want to push it on the back of a viral infection. And so I kept going for these little runs and was feeling terrible afterwards. And I was like, why am I not recovering from this? Everyone else has bounced straight back. And then after maybe 3 or 4 weeks, I felt a peculiar feeling in the back of my throat that I hadn't felt for 20-something years. And that was 20-something years earlier when I'd had glandular fever, what you guys call mono or EBV, at university. And I'd been knocked out for a year with that, which was essentially called post-viral fatigue at the time. And I recognized this feeling in the back of my throat and thought, oh my God, I might be staring down the barrel of another year of this. And that suddenly made me take what was going on quite seriously. And I was about to launch a YouTube channel about running, of all things, and with a smattering of classic cars in it too. And I thought, well, before I put the running vids up, which I'd already shot and edited and have never seen the light of day, just because once I started making the long COVID stuff, it seemed inappropriate to publish those. But anyway, I thought, you know what, I'm just going to look at the science about what we know about SARS-CoV-2 and what we know about post-viral conditions. And is it possible that there's going to be a wave of people who are suffering quite severely after having a COVID infection, given how widespread COVID infection was all around the country? So I put this little film up, and nobody was talking about what was to become long COVID at this point in time. And I wasn't sure if anybody would find it. And suddenly it was just tens of thousands of people all watching this and putting their hands up and just saying, yeah, me too. And I guess that was the start of a journey for me into what became sort of research and advocacy. And I think I found myself in quite a privileged position, because after I'd made a few of these films looking at, the various science that we did have that was out there, I found I had an audience of people who were suffering too, a bunch of other long haulers. And we all had these really pressing questions about what was going on to us, because the doctors were just saying, you're mad, there's nothing wrong with you, you get better after a week, what are you thinking of? There were no tests for it, or there weren't any tests for COVID, let alone for long COVID. And what was also equally confusing for people was the fact that people's antibody tests were coming back negative, and so their doctors are then saying, well, you never had COVID, so this isn't anything to do with COVID. And so then that created all sorts of issues for insurance and things like that in the States as well. So everybody had these really pressing questions, and I found myself in a position where I could throw surveys out to the community and I could get an N of perhaps 2,000 in a couple of days. And actually that data was really, really powerful in terms of answering some of those pressing questions that we all had at the start of this, long COVID experience for those of us who were caught up in the first wave. And I guess from that point on, it's been a little bit like, Alice falling down the rabbit hole into Wonderland, and I'm over 100 videos in now, and a book as well, the Long COVID Handbook, which got published February this year in the States.
Wow, I'm trying to wrap my head around how you managed to manage your own long COVID journey while also tapping
Yeah.
into what was happening in the world at the same time. What was that like trying to juggle the two?
Well, um, difficult, really difficult. But for me, I kind of put what little energy I did have into doing this work because for me it was an attempt to sort of regain some kind of control over this condition that sort of takes all that control away from you, right? There's very few other things that you can do to yourself or that impair you in such a spectacular way. And in terms of removing your faculties as well, and that's one of the hardest things to deal with, is when you lose your ability to think, to process, to talk to people, to have the energy to even read or watch something. It's just, all of those things which you previously took for granted are gone. And you feel completely out of control in your life because all the things that you took for granted are suddenly gone. And I was like, okay, so I'm going to try. It was my attempt then doing this work was me trying to sort of run headlong into this and to try and grab the bull by the horns and say, okay, well, maybe there are answers here. So as much as there was an altruistic drive as well to help people, it was also my own personal quest for answers too. So yeah, it was really hard though. And I felt awful, especially during that first sort of 6 to 9 months. And if you go back and watch some of those videos from that time, A, I've got awful hair. But B, I also looked like I died about a week earlier. You can see I wasn't well.
I imagine people really appreciated that. I'm just thinking so early on when most people hadn't even heard of long COVID, so they were getting COVID and then not getting better, which would be terrifying, and then thinking that you're the only one that this is happening to. So even if there were no answers early on, I imagine it was just a really impactful thing and appreciated thing for people just to come together and be like, this is happening to you too. Okay, let's talk.
Hugely important, especially
Yeah.
when doctors were gaslighting them, families didn't understand, and it's an incredibly difficult condition to understand if you've not suffered from it. So families, spouses, children, parents, all of these relationships were under a huge amount of strain because people didn't understand why you weren't better. They couldn't see anything necessarily obviously wrong with you. And it's a condition that is so sort of nebulous in its nature as well, right? Because one minute you might be passable, you might serve a decent impression of a human being. The next moment, bang, you're gone, right? And that's the inconsistent nature of it that makes it even harder to grasp if you're on the outside looking in. Well, what's going on with this inconsistency here? Are they just putting it on, So I think having that support from the community was incredibly important, especially in the early days.
So I know you're still very much on your journey, which makes it all the more impressive that you're doing everything that you do and makes me very much appreciate you taking the time to speak to my audience because I know it's not easy, but you've been on this journey for a while. So one of the key things I know people always want to know is, what are some of have you found anything effective for recovery that's been helping you or any coping strategies as you go through this that's helped you along? What are some of the key things that stand out for you?
So coping strategies. One thing I would say is that whatever your coping strategies were in life for dealing with things pre-COVID, they may or may not be applicable now. So, for what I dealt with the mental health issues before was, because I suffered from depression for a couple of years, I was an avid runner and I would go out and I'd run really hard, blow the cobwebs off. I'd want to be really productive. I could throw myself into my work and achieve results and get satisfaction that way. Those sorts of things don't work for long COVID. It's a very it's a very different problem that requires very different kinds of solutions. And actually, is it a coping mechanism? Is it just a symptom management strategy? But the old classic pacing really is the most important thing, and I think it's also the hardest thing to do as well. Pacing, because I think a lot of us think, well, I used to do 100 things in a day. I'm now only doing 50 things in a day. Well, surely I've cut down by half. That's got to be fine. But you might actually find that you need to go down to 20 things a day or 10 things a day. And a lot of us are still doing too much. So to actually try and find out how much of your symptom burden is caused by doing too much is a huge part of the process. So that's where pacing comes in, which I break down into 3 sort of categories. You could have a whole hour-long talk about pacing, but the most fundamental part of it is to do less. And then you've got do slower. So the things that you do, you have to sort of do differently. And then the final part is to actually break down the things you do into sort of chunks and actually think about the way that you do things. So even if it's travel, for example, and you've got to go somewhere, I might choose a form of travel that's takes twice as long, that I would never have considered before, if it's low stress and low physical energy output, compared to something that's much faster, but means I've got to walk for 2 miles, right? So it's things like that where you suddenly have to completely reevaluate the way that you do things. I mean, coping mechanisms, right? I guess the other things that have helped me is some medication. So for me personally, I have found a very low dose SSRI very helpful. When I try and come off that, my symptoms get much worse. I'm quite dependent on antihistamines. So when I come off the antihistamines, my symptoms get much worse. And I also take a small amount of niacin, vitamin B3 daily. And without that, my symptoms get much worse. Just about every other supplement that the community talks about, I've tried. None of the others I've really identified as making a massive difference to me personally. But again, we're all different. And then things like breathwork meditation, which are very important for managing your nervous system fundamentally, and also just, they help as a pacing aid too, because if you actually lie down to do breathwork or meditation, then that actually physically stops you from doing things. So I guess that's a sort of a small selection. None of it's rocket science necessarily, but trying to get it right and do it well is always difficult.
I think that pacing one is so important, and it's interesting because the vast majority of people that I talk to hated pacing even before they got sick or even understood what the concept was. Most people I talked to just pushed themselves really hard, didn't really have a sense of managing their energy in their life, probably flirted with burnout a lot, just had a lot, not everybody, but a lot of people that I talked to. And then you get, you run into this brick wall and you have to put into practice this pacing concept times 1,000, like the supercharged expert level version of it. And your concept of small is so not what small is. When I used to think about bringing back an activity, when I'd say how I did it, I'm like, whatever you're thinking in terms of, like when I started exercise and I do 1 minute a day, and I'm like, whatever you're thinking of is the smallest possible, dial that down by 100. Like, just move your arms for a bit. But it's really hard if you were running marathons to start thinking this way. Really tough.
Absolutely, because and I think you touched on something there, which this is a really complex, thorny subject in terms of who is more prone to developing long COVID. But it does seem that amongst us long haulers, there's a lot of us who were incredibly active beforehand, and I've got data that shows that I think 2/3 of my sample group, again of about a sample of about 2,000. Were exercising vigorously for at least half an hour, at least 3 times a week. So that's a lot, right? And there was only, I think, 2%, even 1 or 2% of the whole group were not active day to day. So however you sort of spin that, these people were really, really active and, in the prime of their lives, usually and between 30 and 50 generally. And it's very, very difficult when you've spent your whole life being like that to try and train yourself to be the absolute opposite. And especially if your attitude to problem solving is to try and, sort of have a problem and beat it, right, with energy and application and all the rest of it. Well, this isn't something that you can beat in that way. You actually have to turn all of those instincts off and just calm down and just come to some level of peace and acceptance with it whilst not losing hope for recovery. It's really tough, right?
Yeah, when you've gone through life with an attitude of how to fix a problem is to do more, work harder, try harder, it's a complete 180. Yeah, absolutely. It's a crazy mindset shift. I'm wondering also, just, in those early days of COVID, in addition to this whole pacing concept, what were some of your other biggest challenges that you faced kind of just day to day or getting through this?
Those first sort of 6 to 9 months were really bad in terms of symptoms. So this was before I'd sort of discovered that antihistamines were really going to help me. This is before I discovered that niacin was going to help. This is, I think, before I went on the SSRI. And so my body was just going absolutely haywire. My skin, it was weird. It wasn't like it was coming out in sort of dry rashes, but then also these scabs everywhere that weren't healing. And it stung so much, my skin, even though I was trying not to scratch it, it stung so much that even just moving on the sofa would put me in intense pain. And, even just when your whole body starts visibly breaking down like that as well, the mental health impact is huge as well, because you don't really understand what's going on. You've got a condition for which there's no concrete diagnosis, there's no treatments, and there's no prognosis either, right? And everything that you sort of thought you understood about your body and the way it worked in your mind and your emotional state suddenly get massively sort of spun around, turned upside down, thrown in the bin. Everything that you thought you understood is gone. And I think the mental health side of things is really challenging for people who are suffering with long COVID. And there's a couple of reasons why. I mean, the first of which is that the inflammation associated with the condition has been shown to directly influence depression and anxiety. So there's a direct physiological driver for it. And then there's the secondary thing, which is that your whole life has basically been turned upside down. Your ability to manage your relationships, your ability to work, your ability to sleep, your ability to eat, your ability to drink, all of these things, poof, gone. So I think a combination of things, but certainly mentally, emotionally, very, very difficult in that first year.
Yeah, I used to think about it with my own ME/CFS. It was like I was kidnapped from my life, but yet there was no team trying to find me or save me. Like the world just kept going and I just disappeared. It's what it felt like. And it was just shocking and unfair and frustrating and confusing. And I don't even think I have the vocabulary to describe what it was like.
So one of the ways that I describe it, and this is how I describe it now, actually, I mean, I'm not in that same place I was in the first year, but it feels life to me now, feels a little bit, I don't know if you remember, there's a magician called, I think it was David Blaine, who put himself in a glass box suspended above central London. And he was up there for like 3 days in this glass box as part of his magic trick. And that's a little bit like what having long COVID feels like. You're trapped in this glass box where you can see everybody around you behaving completely normally and doing all of their normal things, but you can't join them. You can't go and do those things with them. And if you start trying to push against the side of the box, well, the sides close in back at you with spikes, and that's sort of the experience where I look at every time, I mean, it was for about 2 years, every single runner that went past my window in front of my office, be a little dagger in the heart, just because you're like, I'd sort of, this feeling of you don't realize how good you've got it, right? You don't appreciate what you've got. And everybody doing everything they take for granted around you. And you watch them all doing it and having, I watch people outside at the bar here opposite, having a wonderful time, drinking a few beers. God, I would love to join them. But I don't have the energy to go down there, let alone tolerate even more than half a beer before my head starts banging and I feel like I need to lie down. So, that's one of the hardest things.
That is a really good description and a really good analogy. And I feel like everyone watching, like I could feel my sort of nervous system go, like everybody watching right now, just take a deep breath. We will get out of the spiky glass box.
Yes.
It is going to be okay. So what is really exciting, or one of the many things that it's exciting to talk to you about, is that you have had the opportunity to talk to so many people and do so much research specifically around long COVID. So what are some of the interesting or more surprising or insightful things that you've come across throughout this process?
Well, so I think there's sort of two answers here. The first answer for people who are new to long COVID is that I would say this was a journey for me in the early days, for sort of 2020. But if you're coming into this now and you've only just recently realizing you've got it, two things that you should probably look into to see if you might suffer from them. And they are mast cell activation, which essentially is an immune overreaction to things, and dysautonomia. And these two sorts of pathologies, if you like, can drive a huge amount of symptoms for many of the people suffering with long COVID. And there are ways of managing those. So, for example, mast cell activation, it's antihistamines and managing diet. And dysautonomia, it's well, it depends what kind of dysautonomia you've got, but there are drugs that you can take to help with that, especially if you've got POTS, which is where your heart rate drops. Heart rate rises by 30 beats per minute when you stand up. So those are a couple of things I'll just quickly mention. In terms of what's sort of new and sort of exciting for me in the research recently, we are seeing quite a lot of research which is being published now in fairly major journals, which is really quite interesting. And they're sort of filling up the jigsaw pieces. So the way I was sort of maybe a year or two ago, I was sort of describing the jigsaw puzzle, if you like, of what's causing long COVID and what is long COVID. Maybe it's a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. We're trying to work out what it's a picture of. And we've got a couple hundred pieces, some around the edges and a couple of corners, and we're trying to work out what the picture in the middle is. And sort of more and more pieces fall onto the table as we get more research and we start to learn more about it. And everybody's standing there arguing, it's a picture of a steam train, it's a picture of a car, it's a picture of a mountain, it's a picture of a cloud, all trying to say, well, no, this is what it's going to be, this is what it's going to be. And I think what we're starting to learn now is we're sort of seeing more of this research come in, is that we're not necessarily looking at a single jigsaw puzzle for long COVID. We're perhaps looking at 5 different ones, and we've got all the pieces mixed up. And so one of the things that we need to try and do is to work out which of these pieces belong in which jigsaw puzzles, which are common to jigsaw puzzle 1, 2, and 3, and which are maybe in 4 and 5. What I mean by that is by essentially saying it is a multi-system condition, and different people suffer very differently to others. And what we're seeing is that there are multiple different pathologies involved. So for some people, there might be 5 of these pathologies. I might be suffering from 1, 2, and 3. You might be suffering from 4 and 5. Now, we may in some cases be able to work out we're different because we have different symptoms, but sometimes actually all of those might present with similar symptoms. And this is the mad thing, right? So microclotting can pretty much explain, pretty much every symptom that we're seeing in long COVID, but so can mast cell activation. So this is where it gets confusing. And I think this is where the really exciting part of research is going to be in terms of dialing in what the phenotypes of long COVID are and being really clear about those and getting consensus on what those are so that when we do treatment trials, we can do them applicably. Because what we're probably going to find is that there isn't a single magic bullet treatment, a pill that's going to come out and cure everyone's long COVID. What we're going to find is that there are some people who respond well to some treatments, and there are other people who respond very well to other treatments. But the trials aren't going to be useful unless we're putting the right people into them who are going to respond to those right treatments because we understand what's causing their symptoms. So again, this all comes down to diagnostics and biomarkers and trying to understand which people go in which group. So, which people are suffering from clotting problems, which people are suffering from viral persistence, which people are suffering from, X, Y, and Z. So this is, I think, one of the great challenges going forwards. But we are starting to see some really good progress on things like serotonin levels being compromised. This was published very recently. And how actually, if the serotonin levels are compromised, that again can set off this cascade of things that can lead to most of the symptoms we're seeing. We're also seeing increasing amounts of evidence for viral persistence, but we haven't yet got a smoking gun, and that's going to be very difficult, I think, without cutting up people. So yeah, we're seeing lots of exciting stuff, but we've still got quite a long way to go.
It's really interesting. Because we've got, I don't even know if you know the stats or the estimates on how many people in the world right now we think have long COVID.
150 million. Yeah, but again,
okay.
It's like, is it 100? Is it 200? But 150.
Yeah. I think once you're over 100 million, it's it kind of just lumps in together. But that's a really good point that we can't assume that everyone has the same thing, and it's tough because people are trying to piece together information from all these different YouTube channels and all these different spaces. And I think that's why, I work to get out as many stories as I can, regardless of how people recovered. Like, I don't care how you recovered. I don't care if you say it was aliens. I respect that. Like, let's just get all the things out there so that we can see what's working for people. And I find that people like you and I are a bit uniquely positioned to get information, because I know that the UK and the US have put, billions of dollars into long COVID research.
Well, notionally, the US has pledged $1 billion into it. We've put about 40 million. So we've been a bit more stingy with it. Yeah. Okay. People have quoted me different numbers. I haven't fact checked them, but it's a lot of money. And to my understanding, not a lot of insight has come from the research. So I'm wondering, how do you find the difference between the research you're doing and, let's say, what the UK in general is trying to do? Like, I feel like there are benefits and advantages to the way you are positioned to interact with people. So what's your take on that? In terms of what research is happening and why? Or and how maybe the information that you're coming across is different than a large government body and the approach that they take to sort of solving long COVID. So, well, that research landscape is really tricky, and we're already seeing in the UK that interest is waning because it's not a subject that any of the political parties want to talk about. And as a consequence of that, it's very difficult to get funding. So we're seeing projects which are have been funded by national funding bodies, which now need more injections of cash to basically get them over the line and get those studies finished. But the cash has run out and more is not forthcoming. And this is really difficult, let alone sort of necessarily getting new studies off the ground. So research is happening, but it's not necessarily happening with the national funds. So I think there's a doctor in the States called Wes Ely, and he's putting together a trial at the moment for baricitinib, which is an immune modulator. And I think they are going down the road of not using the NIH money because the hoops you have to jump through to get it are too difficult and it doesn't quite make sense. So they're finding funding elsewhere. Again, apologies to him if I've got that wrong, but that was my understanding. And I think that's similar in the UK now, where sort of research teams are having to try and put the research together from other ways, not necessarily the national funding bodies, because national funding bodies, I don't know, they're not very nimble, and they look at a lot of stuff in a very old-fashioned way that doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily appropriate to how you solve a problem like long COVID. So, for example, one thing that we got, which we did very well, we did something called the Recover trial in the UK, and this was in, I think, the first year of COVID. This is one of the benefits of having a national health service, is that we ran this huge randomized control trial looking at, I think, 5 different treatments for acute COVID. And they stopped the trial early because they found that dexamethasone was effective at preventing death in severe acute COVID, beyond, statistically significance and all the rest of it. So that was something where they threw a huge amount of money at the problem, used all the power of the NHS, and churned out a result relatively quickly because there was this huge pressure on, acute COVID. We don't have that same political acute pressure on long COVID, and that's a real challenge going forwards. And it's incredibly frustrating as a patient because we look at all of these things. So, for example, just recently, there's been a paper published showing that 3 patients who had Regeneron, monoclonal antibodies, made complete recoveries. And this was Nancy Klimas's team, and this got published in the Journal of Emergency Medicine, literally in the last few days. And so that's the sort of thing where you'd be like, okay, let's immediately do a big RCT on that. And you ought to be able politically to just press the button and make that happen. Or, there's other stuff, like there's people talking on Facebook groups about other antivirals they've tried that have led to complete remission. Why are we not in a position where we can take these sort of promising contenders that have a rationale for working and then just go, you know what, this is a serious problem that has a massive economic issue, because in the UK, we've got 2 million people, now a population of 60 who are unable to work because of long COVID. So there's a huge economic issue, let alone a healthcare issue, let alone a quality of life issue. Why are we not actually trying to deal with this and get these people back into the workforce and actually just throw some money at actually taking some long shots on picking 10, 15, or however much it would cost, 10, 15 different treatments that look like they're rational, throwing some RCTs at them and seeing where we come out. And that's what I would like to do from sort of my perspective, but we don't quite have the consensus yet at the national levels to sort of put those sorts of trials together, unfortunately.
I have a lot of specific questions I want to ask you, but I really don't want to. I want you to tell me, what are some of the significant things if you have come across, or what things pop out that you think would be important for people to know about?
So something I think that's really important to work out how you should perhaps approach your recovery is some findings from a professor in Germany called Carmen Scheibenbogen. And she's an expert in ME/CFS and has more recently been turning her attention towards long COVID. And she had a paper published last year where she broke down long COVID into 2 groups. And the first group, I don't know which is the first and which is the second, but I'm going to call it the first
group.
Yes, one group was essentially like ME/CFS, and the second group was not like ME/CFS. And the way that she was distinguishing the groups that was like ME/CFS was these were people who suffered from essentially post-exertional symptom exacerbation that would start a delayed point in time after any form of exercise. And the other group were people who suffered from that symptom exacerbation either at the time of their exercise or within the next couple of hours. Whereas that first group was next morning or up to 48 hours later. And for me, I think trying to work out which of those 2 groups you're in is quite important in terms of potentially assessing what you might try and do in terms of recovery. So I get messages all the time from people saying, I started going back to the gym again. It was really hard, but I worked through it and now I'm 90% better. And I say, that's fantastic. Did you get PEM before, post-exertional malaise? And always they say no. So there we're in that sort of second group that didn't suffer from that delayed symptom exacerbation. And I think if you're in that second group, so your symptoms are maybe more neurological or they're muscle weakness or that sort of stuff, then it is possible that you could think about essentially building activity gently and managing how it affects your symptoms as you do it. But that might be something that you could think about doing if you didn't suffer from this really acute exacerbation of symptoms and fatigue and everything basically blowing up the day after you do too much, if you're in the first group. But if you are in that first group, which I'm in, so I fit all the diagnostic criteria for ME/CFS, how much you do is going to be a real determinant of, managing your symptoms. So do too much and your symptoms are going to get much worse. So, you can't go down that sort of route of, okay, I'm going to slowly start building up my exercise levels, or I'm going to go to the gym, or I'm going to do weights. I would not advise doing that. For people in that group, you may find that working on nervous system control, you might find that to be hugely beneficial. And when I say nervous system control, I'm talking about things like breath work, like meditation, like very, very gentle reclining yoga, for example, very, very sort of where the movements are essentially non-existent, really. And you may find that nervous system work, which is essentially, when I'm trying to talk about nervous system work here, what I'm talking about is trying to put the body into rest and digest rather than fight or flight. So just jumping back a huge step into what we're talking about here, the nervous system has generally speaking, two states, one of which is the sympathetic state, which is commonly called fight or flight, and one which is the parasympathetic state, which is commonly called rest, digest, and heal. Now, there is another one that's been proposed as well, which is immobilization, which is where you can get to in a crash, but let's not worry about that too much just yet. Stephen Porges is the man to look up if you want to read more about that. But fundamentally, what seems to happen in long COVID and ME/CFS is the body spends too long sympathetically activated, so in fight or flight, essentially. And when you're in fight or flight, you're not able to rest, digest, and heal. So how do we get the body out of fight or flight? Well, we had to do things to calm the nervous system. So those things I mentioned, breathwork, meditation, yoga are important. And what I would also add into that is also emotional release. So there is a hell of a lot of trauma that is associated with suffering from long COVID in terms of just the way it destroys your life and your ability to, and your identity, like on so many different levels. There's so many things that you are going to grieve about the person you were before and about the way you used to live. And what I personally, and what a lot of the other people I've spoken to have found incredibly helpful, is if there is a way that you can access that form of emotional release, and it may not be pleasant whilst you're doing it, it may not be enjoyable to let all those emotions out, whether it's punching the pillow or sitting down and sobbing. Is it putting on music? Is it looking through old photos? What is it that helps you let that stuff out? Once you've done that, I guarantee that your body is going to be a hell of a lot calmer than it was before. And there might be a lot of this stuff that needs to come out. Last year, I went out to Austria and I spent 3 weeks basically just focusing on nervous system work and emotional release. And I was spending, at least half an hour a day crying. But it did me a power of good in terms of actually managing my dysautonomia and a bunch of my symptoms, and helped, I think, put me on it removed one of the roadblocks to recovery. Now, what you might find is that there are more roadblocks for you, and there are other things that you have to resolve in terms of your body and whatever's going on with it to recover. But for some people, that nervous system side of stuff might be the last roadblock left, because the body might be ready to recover. And it's just a question of trying to manage its relationship between the sympathetic and parasympathetic may actually give you, remove that roadblock, get yourself back into parasympathetic, and you may be, on that last stretch to recovery. So that's what I would say in terms of how to perhaps approach the way that you look at your own symptoms and what you should be doing yourself to give yourself the best chance of recovery. From what I've seen amongst everybody I've spoken to who has recovered, not necessarily me because I'm not quite there yet, I haven't dismantled all of my roadblocks, but I've spoken to so many people who have, and that's sort of what I take from it.
Yeah, that trauma piece is really important. And even in my own recovery, before I even understood what was going on, I even talked about this in my book, not trying to be one of those in my book people, but just meaning, even though I didn't fully get it, I said, it was really important for me to make myself cry. And I would put on sad movies, things that I knew were going to make me cry. And when those sad parts came, I would do like a full-on ugly cry that would last half an hour. Like I couldn't stop. Like it would just, like it was way beyond the movie. I'd forgotten about the movie. But it was so helpful. And it might have been tiring and draining that day, but by the next day, I felt so much better. And I just think it's so important to acknowledge the trauma and the grief and everything that people are going through, because it's so rarely mentioned in how to tackle your recovery.
I've got 2 whole chapters in my book talking about the emotional journey because it's such a huge, huge part of it.
So tell us about your book. What can people expect?
Yeah, the Long COVID Handbook, it's by myself and Professor Danny Altman. And what we wanted to do was to try and bring everything that we knew about long COVID into one sort of accessible, curated place. So we speak with 2 voices in the book rather than just one. And that's partly because the 2 sides of this discussion are coming from slightly different places at the moment, from the establishments and the way that the establishment has always worked, and the way that academic research works and the way that clinical trials works. Danny can speak to all of that, and he gives a huge amount of insight into why things work the way they do and why it's important they work the way they do, and how perhaps they need to change in the face of a problem like long COVID. And I bring the patient perspective, as well as my own patient-led research, to talk about the challenges facing us as patients. And so between us, I hope that we sort of create what I wanted to be was sort of like a holding hand for people on their journeys, to be a resource where any questions they had about it would hopefully be answered and addressed in this book.
I think that's really important. And that's what I was kind of trying to ask about earlier, is just, I really see the value in the patient-led research, which is the term I was looking for, but couldn't muster up. But a lot of the research that's happening is so distant from the people who are actually going through it. So people who haven't recovered, people who have recovered have so much to offer. So I think that's really important insight. And of course, Gez's book will be linked in the video description, so I really encourage you to check that out. So, Gez, what would you say to people who are watching who either are new to long COVID or ME/CFS, or maybe have been in it for a while but are just understandably feeling really lost? What are kind of some of the key things that you'd want to say?
I think the first thing you have to do is to try and work out what's causing your symptoms. Now, there may be lots of different things that could be contributing to making your symptoms worse. Probably the most common one is doing too much. However little you think you're doing, there's a good chance you're doing too much. And the way to find this out is to have a day where you essentially do nothing. Try and basically create a duvet day, if you can at some stage, and then see which of your symptoms you don't have the following day. And that is a fairly good indication of telling you, oh, okay, my symptoms are much better after duvet day, and I don't have all of these symptoms. Well, those symptoms are from you doing too much. So what can you do without triggering those symptoms? So I think trying to work out how many of your symptoms are essentially PEM is a huge part of it, because most of us are just sort of bashing through life and actually spending our times in a constant state of PEM, post-exertional malaise, that is. And that's not helping us recover fundamentally. I think it's worth reading about things like dysautonomia, because this is very, very common in long COVID and ME/CFS, and can manifest in a few different ways, whether it's about how you manage heat, whether is your sleep disrupted, let alone if your obvious manifestations are POTS, which is where your heart rate flies up if you're standing and you'll get dizzy and nauseous. But it can manifest in lots of other ways too. From digestion to sleep to heat control, all sorts of things. Anything that the nervous system controls, basically. And then I think it's really about trying to build yourself a support network as well, with people who get it and who understand what you're going through, or who at least want to understand what you're going through, or are curious about what you're going through, rather than minimizing or dismissing it. Because if you are surrounded by people who minimize and dismiss your symptoms and your experience, that becomes a very, very difficult place to be. So I would encourage you to try and surround yourselves, where possible, with people who are supportive and who help you do the things that you need to do for your health. And that's really important too. And of course, if you do want a single resource that might answer any questions you've got, there is the Long COVID Handbook too. And my videos, there's 100 of them. So if you really are bored on your duvet day, you can sit down and watch all of those.
Yeah, your channel is amazing. For you guys watching, it is a wealth of information. If you're not already watching his channel, it is wildly popular. There is so much information. There's so many great expert interviews. It's just such an amazing resource for long COVID. And I think it's so incredible. I think the support thing is so important. I know how much I crave just being able to look someone in the eye, even if it's the virtual eye, and just have them know what my specific type of health felt like, and just be like, yes, it's real. And then also the great thing is that even though we don't have all the answers yet, not even close, we have so many more than we did before. So every day there's more information and more resources out there. So I just think it's so important to get that support. There's no need to try and do this alone or reinvent the wheel. People are figuring things out. So it's just, learn from people like Gez. Watch his channel. There's new information all of the time.
Thank you.
Well, this has been amazing. I'm so excited that you took the time to do this. I know you said that this was one of your less than optimal days. So imagine all of you watching what he's like on his good days. This has been very impressive.
Well, the difference, I think, is fundamentally that on a good day, I wouldn't have to go and lie down after this, whereas today I probably would.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Gez. Absolutely amazing. I have just been on the edge of my seat soaking up every single sentence that you said. Seriously, this is such a wealth of information that I'm sure will be appreciated by many. To those of you watching, please let us know in the comments, what are your main takeaways from this? What else would you add to it? Let's just keep the conversation going. And a massive shout out to our channel member, Sinead Carroll. Thank you so much, Sinead, for joining and becoming a channel member. I really appreciate you and the support, and sending big hugs to you and all of you watching. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it, and I hope to see you in this next video.